On today's episode, I am extremely excited to welcome Sally Craig. More importantly, thank you to Iona for hosting the first ever live edition of the Diaries podcast. Iona is a nonprofit leader here in DC, and they are serving older population and their families in really three ways, and that's by educating, advocating, and providing community-based services with the main goal of helping people age well and live well. So Sally, the floor is yours. Let's hear your Dear Diary entry.
Dear Diary, I've been interested in death and dying all my adult life. I'm 75. Reading Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, pamphlets from the Hemlock Society, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, that sort of thing. Bookshelves full of those. But it suddenly got very real when Judy's husband, Richard, who had ALS, died suddenly one night. She called me and said she didn't want to have the funeral home come and whisk his body away. She wanted to care for Richard's body at home, and she asked me for help. I've been working with a group that educated families on how to care for a loved one after death. But this was my first actual experience of preparing the body, washing and dressing him, and creating a beautiful space for his body to lay for 3 days while his friends and family came to pay their respects. A few years later, it was my turn. It started very innocuously. My husband, Peter, had just turned 81, and his stomach started bothering him. 2 months later, he was dead on Thanksgiving Day. He always said he wanted to leave our house feet first. We were able to honor that wish 3 days later as we carried his body out to the funeral home vehicle, wrapped in a quilt, tied around him with his old neckties.
Sally, thanks for sharing your Dear Diary entry with all of us. Just to kick things off, can you tell us a little bit briefly about Peter's personality and who he was?
Peter was an attorney. He was a civic activist and leader on stopping freeways from coming down Wisconsin Avenue in the 60s, from keeping McLean Gardens from becoming like a Pentagon City in the early 70s. And he was also a genealogist and historian.
So if you're comfortable sharing, Sally, how did Peter die?
Well, it's a little bit of a complicated story because his diagnosis didn't come until after he was dead.
Wow.
He started just feeling like stomach problems. He went to the gastroenterologist. Then shortly after that, that was at the end of September. His personality started to change. He started falling. We thought maybe it was rapid onset Alzheimer's. And there came a point where I went to his primary, and we had he got a MRI of his brain. And the MRI revealed severe atrophy of the brain. Now, this was a man who had an incredible brain. He got a Lifetime Achievement Award from an organization at the end of October, just a month before he died, and gave a speech. So it was happening really, really quickly. And I ended up taking him to a neurologist who said, well, it's possible that he has Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Do you know what that is, Paul?
No.
It's mad cow disease. So needless to say, I went right on WebMD and looked on the internet, and everything that I read pointed to the fact that that's what he had. But in order to diagnose that, they needed to take a spinal tap. And the doctor explained to me that it was going to take a few weeks for the results to come back, because he said that he made this analogy. He said, like, a bacteria is as big as a room, a virus is as big as a fingernail, and a prion, which is the rogue protein that is the disease mechanism of mad cow is the size of a hair. So there are very few. There's like one place in the United States that can find that. It's in Cleveland. So November 9th, I think, was when he had his MRI, and the doctor called the Monday after Thanksgiving to say that, in fact, they had found the prions. And one of the things that was so difficult about that was that his primary care physician was very unwilling to make a hospice referral. And he was getting worse and worse, having more and more trouble, like climbing the stairs, just eating, thinking, and so I could tell that he was, rapidly declining, and felt that we needed some support and some help. And his primary care doctor wouldn't make a hospice referral. So finally I called this young neurologist and basically begged him to make a referral, and he said, well, I need to examine him, bring him in. And I said, I can't bring him in. And he said, well, call an ambulance. And I said, no, I'm not going to call an ambulance. He needs to be here. He's not in pain. He doesn't need to be in the hospital. I really didn't want to have it all medicalized. And so this brave doctor said, okay, I'll make the referral. And that was on a Thursday, and the following Thursday was Thanksgiving Day. So,
Sally, I'm not exactly sure what mad cow's disease is, so can you give us like the elevator spiel
well,
of what
it's
it is?
a prion is a protein that basically chews up the brain, and typically it's spread by contaminated brain meat or a corneal transplant. Undertakers have gotten it from doing autopsies on the brain, but actually 85% of all Creutzfeldt-Jakob is genetically is a genetic, or is random rather. 85% is just spontaneous, 10% is genetic, and 5% comes from some kind of contamination. But there's no cure for it. They don't really understand how this protein folds and chews and does its dirty work.
Yeah, so you found out Thanksgiving Day. Walk us through the experience of finding out exactly what it is and kind of what the prognosis was.
Well, we found out he died on Thanksgiving Day. We found out we didn't find out till after he died. The results is when the results came back.
Yeah.
So
at what point did you realize that, like, this is really bad? I know something is happening to my husband.
When they told me that his brain was severely atrophied, which was November 9th. And, that's when I got really desperate about needing hospice. And it took 2 more weeks for hospice for me to get a referral, because I kept trying to, persuade his primary care doctor that he needed it. And he would say, well, Mrs. Craig, we don't have a diagnosis yet. And I said, well, doctor, he can't walk, he's incontinent, he can't think, can't go up and down the stairs, Yeah,
that has to be scary. So in the Dear Diary entry, you mentioned that one of his wishes, he wanted to be carried out of the house feet first, and so that meant you had to prepare the body at home. So walk us through. I'm sure some people are curious, myself included. How does one prepare a body, and where did you learn? Like, fill us in and tell us all the things.
Right. Well, I had gotten interested in this in probably 2002. I saw a documentary on PBS called A Family Undertaking, which is about the home funeral care, the home death movement, and it is a movement. It's basically about reclaiming the way that we used to do it. We used to lay out our, grandparents on the dining room table, or, keep their bodies at home for a wake or whatever. Embalming didn't even start until after the Civil War, or, during the Civil War. And most people don't understand that, embalming is not a legal requirement. Using a funeral home is not a legal requirement. So anyway, I saw this documentary, and one of the women featured in it was a woman named Elizabeth Knox, who actually at that point was lived in Tacoma Park, and I had friends who knew her, and I started learning about her organization called Crossings, Caring for Our Own at Death, and there is a website, crossings.net, and so I contacted her. I went to one of her trainings about caring for a body, and I got a copy of the documentary, and I started showing it to my friends. I had some viewings at home and at my church, at St. Albans Episcopal Church. And so I started people started coming to me to ask them to help. And my friend Judy, that I talked about in my diary entry, was the first person. And that was an amazing experience. We got there. Beth Knox came with me. We got there one morning, and Richard's body was upstairs. He had died at about 1 o'clock in the morning. This was about 9 o'clock the next day. And while we were there, Judy's son and daughter-in-law walked in, had just gotten off the train. They'd come down from New York, and they were, Judy or I said, "Do you want to go upstairs and see Richard's body?" And they were like, "Oh, no. We can't do that." And so they were scared. Most of us aren't used to seeing dead bodies. And I said to them, it's okay. You can do that. You can go. And, it was so amazing, Paul. Once they stepped over that threshold and walked into the room and saw him lying there, it's like their hearts and minds just opened. And they were and then they found out that initially they were horrified that we were keeping his body. It was like, call the funeral home, get him out of here. And Judy said, "No, we're not going to do that." And so once they stepped over that threshold of fear and concern, they were thoroughly engaged. And how can we help? So we sent her son out to Talbot's to get dry ice. We had her daughter go to Johnson's, which was still open, and to buy flowers. And Judy and I worked on bathing Richard's body. Well, first we cleared all the hospital gear out of the room. Anyway, this was December 19th. So it was just before Christmas. And the four of us working together just transformed the room into this beautiful space of just was calm and peaceful, and there was a pine bough that was draped over the headboard, and there were beautiful flowers and pictures, and we dressed. Richard was a Francophile, and so
What's a Francophile?
Someone who loves all things French. So we put a beret on him, and we had I think next to the bedside table was a glass of nice Burgundy, and a book of French, of Baudelaire, French poetry or something it's like a little scene really. And so the actual preparing of the body, would you like me to talk about that?
Yeah. I'm interested in that. Okay.
Yeah. So, Richard had been in hospice, so and I, my husband as well too, and so his body wasn't really dirty. The hospice, one of the things that hospice does provide, if you're at home, is they send a certified nurse assistant in every day to wash the body, change the sheets, in the hospital bed. So the washing the body was kind of, almost like ritualistic. We had a basin of water. We put in some drops of lavender essential oil. We had some nice cloths, and we just basically gave him a little sponge bath. And we, one of the things that people are really curious about and may or may not have the nerve to ask is, well, what about like bodily secretions that might come out, you know? And so there's ways of dealing with that, you know, either a cotton ball in the anus, or a diaper. And we did the former, but there wasn't any problem with that. How do you keep the body from decomposing? And if you're not embalming it, well, first of all, that takes, depending on how the person dies. This was not a violent death. It was not his body wasn't ravaged by cancer, or those are different circumstances. But in this case, first of all, it was December, so we kept a window open in the room, but we also put dry ice under his head, his heart, and his midsection, and that pretty much keeps the body cool enough so that there's no decomposition, no odors. We have all these ideas, but I mean, in fact, it's very simple and very normal, you know? Yeah.
This question might be in the weeds, but how long can you keep a dead body on ice? Like, are we talking more than a week, or is it just a couple of days?
Probably, yeah. I mean, they keep dead bodies in the morgue for, in the ice drawers for a long time. Sure, yeah.
Yeah. How many body preparations have you been a part of now?
Probably about a half a dozen. Yeah. But I've coached people through it more than that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you coach someone through the preparation? Just over the phone, or?
Yeah, over the phone. Folks have called me, and they've been in Richmond, or I had dear friends in Berkeley that wanted to do it, and so I sort of. I mean, there's a manual. There's a how-to, but I think sometimes people need a little extra, attention that they don't necessarily think they. Our goal in Crossings was to empower families. We were not about making money. We did not want to be consultants and go in and charge by the hour. That was not, we're not into that. We were into helping families care for their own.
I know you mentioned the siblings or the kids that walked into the room and they were really afraid at first. Today, the End of Life Expo, we've been talking a lot about preparation, aging. Any advice for someone, given your experience handling half a dozen bodies, preparation, if you've never seen one before and you're about to walk in, what are some ways that you can prepare yourself or best manage that for the first time?
I think it just depends. It depends on, the kind of, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that, how to prepare yourself. I mean, I think you just walk in. You just cross that threshold. You might need somebody to hold your hand to do it. There's certainly in the funeral home. If we had gone the funeral home route and it had a viewing, that's a very normal, common thing to do. There's streams of people who go see, who pay their respects. This is a little different because there's no, you could put makeup on. You could, when we dressed my husband, we put him in, his white turtleneck and his navy blue blazer, and he had been knighted by the King of Sweden, and so we put his medals on, and we decked him out.
How'd you know what he wanted to be dressed in? Is that something that you all had talked about?
No, we didn't.
Yeah, something that people have talked a little bit about today is the estate planning. I know this happened kind of quickly. Is that something that you had in place as far as estate or end-of-life care?
It's crazy. When we did the 5 wishes about 25 years ago, and we had them witnessed and signed, sealed, and delivered. And during the, as it became clear that he was dying, I was like, where did we put those 5 wishes? Where are they? And, he was incredibly well organized. And it turns out, and I didn't ever find them until after the whole thing was over. And there they were sitting in a notebook, right on the ledge, right. We laid him out on my massage table in his study, my husband. And so there the 5 wishes were right there. And I looked through them, and everything that he'd wanted or didn't want was what had happened. Yeah. All right.
So now that you're helping other people prepare the bodies, what's that like to help other people based on your experiences?
It is, it's an amazing experience. It is such a privilege and such a powerful experience. It is a spiritual gift to be able to care for a dead body. And I one of the things, there's no research on this, there's no data, but I am a firm believer, it certainly was the case for me and for others, that it really helped with the grieving process.
In what ways did it help?
Well, in our case, Peter lay in state, or if you will, that's a little pretentious, but he lay in his study for we had visitation for 2 nights. And we had lots of people from the neighborhood, people from my church, from his church, visit and come through. And I spent, and his body was not left alone at all. There was someone there 24/7. So I would, and it wasn't me, there was a whole rota of people. So I would sort of wander in and out, and I could see over the course of the 3 days between Thursday and Sunday, how, when he first died, it was like, this might sound a little woo-woo, but it felt like the spirit was still there. It was still lingering. And by the end of the 3 days, there was, it was clear that, he was really gone. And I could watch that, happen to him. I could watch his features become sort of more rigid as the rigor mortis set in. The color drained pretty quickly. And then there was just this kind of, it's hard to describe if you haven't been around a body that's been dead for a while, but it's kind of definitely an absence. Definitely an absence.
Yeah. For those of you that are just joining us, we'll be taking questions here in about 15 minutes. I'm talking with Sally Craig about her experiences with her husband. Sally, this upcoming Thanksgiving will be 10 years.
Yeah, that's right. Wow.
It feels like yesterday. I can see you replaying those visitations in your head almost, and that description in the Dear Diary. What's it like? What's it been like over the last 10 years and not having him around, and where are you at now in your life?
You sort of threw me with that, thinking about the 10th anniversary of his death.
Sorry.
So I'm kind of stuck there, wondering. The first year after he died, I took my daughter and her husband and their 4 children and their nanny to Disney, which was a big mistake. But anyway, they loved it. I was miserable. But I just thought, let me just get out of Dodge here, I think about him. I think about him a lot. But I've moved on. I've moved on. He was 15 years older than I was. So I always expected that sort of in the normal order of things, he would die before I did. And we were married for 40 years. So I sold the big house, and after a decent interval, got into a relationship, and now I'm in another one. So, but he was a powerful figure in for many people. So in some respects, he lives on. Yeah.
This may be a little personal, but I know you said nothing is uncomfortable for you. So I know some people, when you're in a relationship, you think that person is going to be your forever person. If they were to die, you would never date again. And they don't talk about it. They don't want to think about it. Is that something that you and Peter ever talked about, being as he was 15 years older? Did you ever say, hey, if you go first, I might start dating again?
Oh, yeah. He knew me well enough to know that.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
What was that conversation like?
Oh, gosh. I mean, we probably had it several times. The sad thing about the way Peter went was that it was so quick. There wasn't really time for us to, his mind went so quickly that there wasn't really time for us to process, to have like a serious conversation. He probably would have said, I hope you find somebody else. I hope you, whatever, sell the house to our daughter, or, we had some of those conversations, but we really couldn't process those important things. So I guess one of the takeaways was, don't wait till, I'm sort of a Buddhist, and one of the things we say is that anything could happen to anyone at any time. So, we don't know how much time we're given. So.
Yeah. I do want to jump back. I know I said I didn't want to jump back and forth, but I'm going back to the preparation of the bodies. If someone listens to this episode and they're like, that's it, I want to do that, I want to prepare the body at home, what do you suggest? Where do they start?
Well, first of all, I hope that happens. I would suggest that they go to crossings.net. I would suggest that they look up, there's an organization called the National Home Funeral Alliance, NHFA.org, that has a wonderful website with lots of resources and stories about that. They could call me.
So people can actually call you up and say, hey, I have a dead body, I need some help.
Well, presumably it's like a little before. I mean, there's stuff they need to do.
Yeah,
like
what?
Figure out where to get the dry ice. There's one place in D.C. that you can get it, Talbot's. And so, it's not something you can order on Amazon.prime. You could probably order the lavender oil and the beeswax candles that we advocate using. But by the way, I should give some attribution. This the Crossings organization was based on the teachings of Rudolf Steiner, who is an Austrian educator and philosopher and scientist, who had a belief that it took several days for the spirit to actually leave the body after death, and that it was very beneficial to the deceased person's spirit to vigil with the body after the death, and to, if possible, recite verses, stories, talk to the body. So
I have just a couple more questions, then I'd like to open it up a little earlier for questions, because I've asked you what I wanted to, and I want to make sure other people have a chance to as well. How are those experiences shaped how you believe or look at death now?
Well, I'm going to go a little into stand-up now, okay? So, I think that most of us have this notion that we want to die in our beds with, in our lovely nighties with our high thread count sheets, and just have everything just perfectly so. That's an illusion. That's not the way it usually happens for most people. So I think being sort of spiritually prepared for anything that could happen at any time is really important. Yeah.
So I know you said that is not realistic most cases. How do you want to go?
Just like that, with high thread count and my nice nightie, with my grandchildren and children and boyfriend, all there singing to me, and have that wonderful musician that was over at the thing playing the violin. And oh yeah, I mean, we were playing the Mozart Requiem when my husband died, over and over and over. Yeah.
So, how old are you now? Do you mind saying?
75.
You're 75. You're at an end of life expo.
Oh, I thought you said I was at the end of life.
You're at an end of life expo, talking about death and preparing dead bodies. Why do you care so much about death?
Why are you laughing? It's one of the great mysteries. It's one of the great mysteries. And it is just, it has pulled me for, the last, I would say, 40 years. I was in the Peace Corps in West Africa, and I attended my first death and aftermath of that with a friend of mine, a French woman who died after 2 days after giving birth, and I sat with her while she was dying and after she died, and I think that experience when I was 22 years old really imprinted on me and sort of opened me up to this.
I have one question, then we're going to dive into the rest here. We've got some really good questions for you. Imagine we hear a knock on the window, and you turn around, and Peter's standing there. What would you do or say to him?
Wow. Hey, hi, Peter. I mean, that's just off the wall, that question. I can't, I'd be happy to see him. I'd be a little, I have a new man in my life. I don't know how that would be a little tricky,
Yeah. What's the funniest moment you've ever had at a humor funeral? Let me try this again. What's the funniest moment you've ever had at a home funeral?
There's a lot of gas. There's a lot of gas. And so one of the things that we do is or that can be done is that to get rid of some of that is kind of to press on the abdomen, and then there's a lot of gas. Yeah. And you just have to, it's like, okay, that's funny, fart jokes are funny.
So you go press on their belly like a whoopee cushion. You
right,
laugh, exactly.
Laugh about it.
Yeah. All right. So this is about Peter as far as the Dear Diary entry goes. Why did he want to be carried out feet first?
He did not want to go, I guess he could have been carried out head first. The point is he wanted to die in his home. And, he wanted to die in his home.
So to piggyback on that, why a quilt and why his neckties?
Good question. The quilt was draped over the massage table, and it was a quilt that I had bought in Moscow in 1991. But that's irrelevant. That's just a little detail. Anyway, so it was just easy to just wrap that, just to sort of fold him up in the quilt. And then we were thinking, now how are we going to attach this? And we were just wandering around the bedroom and his study, and my nephew, grown man, opened his closet door, and Peter was famous for his bow tie neckties, which were these old-fashioned skinny bow ties that were just really impossible to find. But he had about 10 of them, and Dan said, let's tie his neckties together and use that. And it just was like the perfect thing to do. And so our grandsons are the ones that tied the bow ties around the quilt, around his body.
What was that like for the grandsons?
That was amazing. Yeah. That was amazing. And then the oldest grandson, who at that point was 7, the twins were 5, and the little one was in utero. But the 7-year-old, we had also had a Tibetan scarf around his neck, And the 7-year-old took that off, and he also took off the medal from the King of Sweden. And he several days later, we had to return that to the Swedish embassy. And Miles, age 7, came with me to return his grandfather's medal.
Wow.
Yeah. And then we had some friends. Well, his brother, our nephew, our grandchildren, my daughter, her husband, and a Jewish friend came, and she recited the Mourner's Kaddish. And I think we sang, I can't remember, probably sung something, probably said the Lord's Prayer, and, you know. And then the funeral home came, and I have to put a little plug for RAP's funeral home. They were so accommodating and so helpful. And when they showed up there, these 2 young women, and I thought, my God, 2 young, how are they going to carry this? He was 200 pounds. How are they going to get him down the stairs and down several flights of stairs? And it was all of us, well, not all of us, the men helped carry his body out to the, they don't use hearses anymore, unless it's in a funeral procession. It was just kind of a nondescript station wagon. Yeah.
Yeah. This kind of ties into another question that we got as far as you mentioned the funeral home. Is there a legal requirement to notify anyone or someone of a death at a home funeral?
Yeah, I mean, there's a legal requirement to notify the powers, the city, and so Peter was in hospice. So as soon as he died, we called the hospice, and they sent the hospice nurse. Took her about an hour or 2 to get there. Meanwhile, the turkey is baking and roasting, and the table is set. And she came and pronounced him, and then the hospice files the death certificate, files the paperwork to get a death certificate with the health department, and I think it's vital. I'm not sure exactly what what agency is, but it's the health department, and then you tell them how many death certificates you need, and you always need more than you think you're going to need, because everyone wants an original of the death certificate with the seal on it, and the city charges. Back then, they charged $18 a piece for those death certificates. Anyway, and then. So that's, but you do need a funeral. You need in order to transport a body, you need to have a funeral home. You need a transport license, or not a license, but a document that allows you to transport a body. And he was being taken to the crematorium, so the funeral home, we eventually called RAP and made an appointment for them to come pick his body up, and so.
We have a question here about a specific item as far as preparing the bodies go. I know we talked about the lavender and essential oils, the cotton, a diaper, dry ice. What do you use the beeswax candles for? Yeah, what are those for?
Well, they're, I think that's kind of a Waldorf Steiner kind of thing. They like really natural candles. And so we had candles, and they're long burning, and they're very pure, and they have other sort of mystical properties that I don't really know what they are, but so in the room, if you're going to lay out the body, you'll want to have some candles lit all the time. So we recommend beeswax candles.
Yeah. This has been another episode of the Death Diaries podcast with your host, Paul King. We have time for a couple more questions if anyone has any. If not, I will do the outro again, and we will say that's a wrap and get out of here a little early. Sally, any questions I should have asked you that I didn't ask?
Well, one of the things that was a little difficult was that, Peter knew that that I was involved with Crossings. He had seen the documentary probably twice, a family undertaking. But we never really actually had the conversation like, this is what we're going to do with you. So I never really got his permission to do that. And I felt a little weird about that. But one of the things that happened to him is that he got really, with his brain getting chewed up, he got really scared and paranoid. And would have these sort of terror, he would be terrorized by things that he couldn't really explain what they were. You could just see it in his eyes and his face. And, I didn't really feel like I could sort of say, oh, guess what? This is what we're going to do. So, my father died 2 years before Peter did, and he'd had lung cancer and he'd had a fall, and he was living on the Cape, and he was admitted to. He was in the ER, and then they put him in the ICU, and he wanted to go home, and I had to tell him that we couldn't really do that because he was, he'd broken ribs, he'd punctured a lung, and that was on a Tuesday morning, and he died Thursday. And everyone knew, my brothers and he and friends knew about that I was interested in after-death care. And one of my brothers was also very interested in this, and so when he died, we dispatched my brother-in-law to go get the dry ice, and we were going to wash his body in the hospital and then take him home, and so we started doing that. And my mother had dementia at that point, and we were sort of in the process of that, and my phone rang, and for some reason, I guess I hadn't turned the ringer off, I answered the phone, and it was another one of my brothers, and said, Mom doesn't want that. She doesn't want his body to come home. So, we obviously couldn't do it. So there's a whole piece around talking to family members about that. And, when I started to talk about Judy and her son, Andy, when he saw, his initial reaction was, oh my God, you can't be, you're not serious that you're going to do this. So there's definitely some family preparation that should happen. Yeah.
Well, Sally, thank you for joining us, and thank you to the first ever live audience. This has been another episode of the Death Diaries podcast with your host, Paul King. If you or someone you know has a story you'd like to share, head on over to thedeathdiariespodcast.com. Again, that's thedeathdiariespodcast.com, and let us know. We'd love to have you on the show. Until next time, let's talk about death.